to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Hi, I'm Paul Davenport, and welcome back to the Bible Feed podcast. We're going to continue in this episode exploring some ideas that are similar to what we looked at last time. We considered the concept of heaven in our last episode. So we looked up and we imagined ourselves as an ancient Israelite looking up to the heavens and thinking about the dwelling place of God. But we actually found that heaven is not so much about a location, a physical location, but it's much more about a relationship with God and a relationship with God in particular through Jesus Christ. So this episode, we're going to start by looking down, and we're thinking about where is hell. And I suspect that when we do that, we will find that hell perhaps isn't so much about a physical location, but is about something else. But I'm joined by Dan Weatherall, who's going to help us through this subject and understand it from a biblical point of view. So welcome, Dan.
Hi, Paul.
This subject can be quite disturbing in some ways because the kind of images that hell conjures up in the imagination are not particularly pleasant. Just to give you an example, as we think about the sort of baggage that comes with the word hell and that term. I was in an art gallery a few weeks ago. There's a lovely Georgian house in the Warwickshire countryside, a place called Compton Verney, and it's now an art gallery. And as we were wandering around this art gallery, there's a picture in the corner of one of the rooms. Not very big, but it caught my eye. Got closer to it. It's only 12 inches square. And the title of the painting is "Descent into Limbo" by a Dutch artist, Peter Hughes. It was a picture of the most horrific images of kind of distorted human forms merged with animal forms and suffering all sorts of torment and torture and being boiled in cauldrons and in fires and sawn into bits. It was really horrific. And unfortunately, that's the sort of image that, paintings coming from a few centuries ago tend to get associated with this idea of hell. But hopefully we're going to move beyond that.
Yeah. It's whenever I think of the word hell, you just think of fire that never goes out, don't you? Unquenchable fire, and sort of a fiery place of just incredible torment, which is part of the idea, probably. I mean, because there's lots of baggage, isn't there, behind all of this, and partly a sense of perhaps churches or the church establishment or political institutions, as they were part of the church at the time in sort of medieval times and so on, have maybe used the concept of hell or fear of hell as a way of controlling. Yeah,
as you say, it's linked with fire and eternity. That is burning for this eternal torment idea, which is a difficult thing to get your head around in connection with God, with a loving God.
Yeah.
So there is an issue there that needs sorting out.
Yeah, there's definitely an issue with how we understand God and how we understand God through Jesus. Jesus, one who was full of grace and truth. So there's mercy and justice. Where is the justice in tormenting someone for eternity who was a finite being who committed a finite number of sins? If you want to sort of put it in an equation sort of term, that it's troubled a lot of people.
It creates a moral issue. There's perhaps just a little hint about where some of this baggage comes from. I was reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion, and just by chance came across a reference. He was talking about the period of history around the 9th century when Anglo-Saxons were being converted to Christianity. And he says, and I'll just quote the short passage, he says, "The rhythms of life and death and the cycle of the year proved no less adaptable to the purposes of the Anglo-Saxon church. So it was that hell," and that's Hel, which was the pagan underworld where all the dead were believed to dwell, became, in the writings of monks, the abode of the damned. So there's a little hint there that the kind of concepts that we're starting out with here have come from a pagan mindset and have sort of been adopted as a way of integrating into Christian society.
As indeed lots of other things, were adopted, weren't they? So we know that happened. We've talked a little bit about that, haven't we? The soul and things like that.
Okay. So just with that, kind of thinking about some of the baggage attached to it, clearly there's a long and complicated cultural history attached to this English word that we ended up with hell. So what we really need to do, and what we want to do in the next half an hour or so, is just break it down, go back to the basics, and kind of build it up in manageable chunks.
Yeah.
And you're going to help us do that.
Yeah, hopefully.
What's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, so I think the way of doing it is looking at the Old Testament first and just really looking at the words used. So, if we do that and go to the Old Testament, first of all, Old Testament, of course, being written in Hebrew, it's the word Sheol. Okay.
Yeah, and when you look for that word, I mean, we find it in the King James Version, for example. You'll see about half and half it's translated hell or the grave. But in the later versions, like the English Standard Version, hell seems to have been dropped as a word that's used. In the ESV, for example, once it's translated grave, but the rest of the times, 64 times, it's just left as Sheol, which is not terribly helpful.
No, I mean, it kind of tells a story, doesn't it? It tells a story of ambiguity at the very least. That that there's a question mark over what this means, and they've just sat on the fence, I suppose, or just decided, left it up to the reader. Which you're right, that's not translating, but at least it alerts us to the problem there. When you sort of do a survey of that word and where it appears, you do find, that conception that you started off with in that painting, we have in our mind's eye that it's the wicked that end up in hell. So we should expect that the wicked people should be in Sheol. And you definitely get that. So you get, for example, in Psalm 9, the wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forgot God. So the wicked are going to be in Sheol. But when you carry on looking, you find out that the faithful have that prospect of being in Sheol as well. So just a few Psalms on, Psalm 16 and verse 10. So this is the faithful psalmist who says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption." So there's the prospect of him going there. He's concerned about that. He's concerned about him losing his life, effectively.
It doesn't seem to differentiate or discriminate between good, bad people.
No. People who die end up in Sheol, basically.
And in fact, that verse in Psalm 16 is referred to Jesus.
In the New Testament, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I think hopefully we'll get time to look at that in a few moments. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So Sheol is a conception of a place where good people and wicked people, in inverted commas, both end up. It's not discriminatory. You then also find is that in the conception of this word, people can't be delivered from the power of Sheol. So once you're there, that's it. There's no one can redeem their brother and bring them back. That's the sort of phrase that we get. And then once you're there, it sounds like it's a pretty terrible place because there's no way to remember God. You can't praise God. That's in Psalm 6, for example. And then you get, it's worth perhaps having a look in Ecclesiastes 9. So this piece of wisdom literature that's full of doom and gloom and, very much pondering the meaning of life and concluding that a lot of it is pointless, which raises its own questions.
Yeah, the key word from Ecclesiastes is vanity.
That's right. Meaningless.
That's sort of like a vapor.
Yeah, that's right. So listen to this then. So the preacher in Ecclesiastes says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going." It's very, very upbeat.
Okay. So
that's a reflection. I think the whole book of Ecclesiastes is a reflection on the prospect of the fact that we all face death. That's it. We're all going to end up in Sheol. And death itself ends up being paralleled with Sheol. Probably one of the closest examples of that is back in the Psalms. Psalm 30, verse 3, "O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit." Verse 9, "What profit is there in my death? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness?" So there's lots of things going on in that psalm, but the only thing we need to sort of think about is the fact that going down to Sheol or the pit is somewhere where you can't praise God. Your existence is pretty much ended, and that's paralleled. That is death, basically. That's what it's saying.
Okay.
It's a psalm about God delivering from death, which is something we'll think about in a bit.
So that's a quick survey of this word Sheol, which in many versions is now not translated, but by looking at the context and the way it's used, you can establish a bit about what it means. It's not a place for wicked. It's not discriminating between the wicked and the good, and you can't return from it, and it's sort of equivalent death. Now, but when you look up the word Sheol in lexicons and Bible dictionaries, it uses phrases like this is the underworld, or the abode of the dead, a waste, a void, a place under the earth where the dead reside, and things like that. So that sounds a little bit more like not just death, but a place of some kind of spiritual darkness, rather than the grave or a hole in the ground. So maybe we've not quite got to the full meaning of that yet, or there's a little bit more to say.
Yeah, it's interesting that previously Sheol was translated a number of times as the grave, whereas now it seems not to be. And that's probably because whilst that's an approximation to the word, because of what you've said, it's not a full, it doesn't capture the full essence of what the word means. For example, there's another passage in Ezekiel, so it's Ezekiel chapter 32. It's quite an amusing chapter, actually. It's all about Pharaoh. It's a poetic description against Pharaoh, an oracle against Pharaoh, and it describes him being killed and going down to Sheol. And as he goes down to Sheol, he's sort of welcomed by all the other fallen leaders, the fallen rulers, and all the other people there, and they sort of welcome him down here, saying, great to see you. And but clearly, it's not meant to be taken as this is going to happen to that particular person, and he's going to experience that consciously, because all throughout it, you get verbs like sleep and rest. So interwoven among that poetic description is presenting an underworld, for sure it is, but in a way of basically showing that there's no return. They're there, they're in the underworld, they're there, they're sleeping, they're resting. And sometimes for amusement's sake, we imagine them welcoming the people who join them. But that's for our amusement and for our sort of way of showing the certainty of them being down there.
Right.
It's the death state that's being talked about. So Sheol sort of is equivalent to the death state rather than it is equivalent to the grave.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. And I'm just thinking of how we use the English word grave in that it obviously has a primary meaning of the hole in the ground. But we could also use that word by association with that to mean death. It seems like with the word Sheol, layered on top of that are these poetic depictions of what it means to emphasize and reinforce and dramatically portray the lack of hope and possibility of returning from that state from a natural point of view.
Yeah, that's the critical thing about Sheol in the Old Testament, is that if you get there, or when you get there, because you're all going to end up there according to Ecclesiastes, when you get there, that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm painting a broad brush because of course you get ideas of resurrection in Daniel and so on, and that's something we'll think about in a moment when we turn to the New Testament. But in terms of without God, without any hope that God can give of restoring your life, once you're in Sheol, that's it, and you effectively in oblivion.
And all the things that you would associate normally with consciousness are gone.
Yeah.
Such as, thoughts, that passage in Ecclesiastes, there's no work or thought or wisdom or knowledge, all of those things to do with consciousness. So it's an unconscious state.
That's right.
So is that the Old Testament word?
Yep.
Is that the only word used? Is it time to move into the New Testament?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So in the New Testament, we find primarily a couple of words. So the first one is Hades. That's probably one that's probably a bit more familiar. Of course, we're in Greek now in the New Testament.
Okay.
So the Greek word Hades. It's only used a handful of times, actually, isn't it? 10 times.
Okay.
In the New Testament. So it looks like the ESV again have done the same thing. So they have translated it as hell once, and the rest of times they've kept Hades in there. So they're sitting on the fence again.
Right, and left us to draw our own conclusions.
It's given us a podcast material, you see. That's by doing that. We've got to
Absolutely.
explain it. So Yeah, the King James translated it hell all the time. So this word in the New Testament, we need to think about what that means. And I think one of the best places to look at, you alluded to it earlier, was when Peter quoted Peter quoted Psalm 16, and he did that in Acts chapter 2. So in Psalm 16, it talked about you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. And in Acts chapter 2 and verse 27, Peter, talking about Jesus, is quoting Psalm 16, and he says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." So you can see how Hades is equivalent to Sheol.
Okay.
And in all sort of practical ways, it effectively is an equivalent to Sheol. It's sort of saying the same thing. It's being used in the same place. I think the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses the word Hades pretty much every time the word Sheol occurs. So yeah, you've effectively got an equivalent term to some extent. So what's interesting here is that Peter's talking about Jesus, who died on the cross, was put in the tomb, and then on the third day was raised from the dead. And he's applying this passage about Sheol, Hades, and applying that to Jesus, who was alive, and then he died. And according to everything we know about from the rest of the scriptures, it was unconscious and, not alive. And then on the third day, his life was restored. He was resurrected. So this, idea of sleeping in the dust of the earth, except until you're raised and delivered from Hades by God through resurrection, that makes sense.
Okay, so and that's really useful, because we've got a clear link there between Old Testament and New Testament, and then in the New Testament application, a clear physical example of what it means to be in Sheol/Hades and what it means to come out of that state of being dead. That's fine, but I have a question. Hades, as you said, it might be a word that's a bit more familiar, and it is when you think about Greek mythology and some of the Greek tales. And Hades in that Greek context seems to be absolutely linked with a place where the dead go and have some form of conscious existence. Just the example of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and Orpheus goes down into the underworld to try and rescue Eurydice, who he's fallen in love with. So the concept is there attached to that Greek word. We said there's baggage attached to the English word hell. Well, there's baggage attached to the Greek word Hades. So when the New Testament writers use that word, or when the translators of the Old Testament use that word, surely they would know that baggage is attached to it, and people would associate those kind of things with it. Does that mean that those ideas should be associated with it?
It's a fair question. I suppose we're making an assumption that the very Hellenistic Greek tales and culture and so on were transferred along with the fact that they spoke Greek in Judea, or was it just the language? I mean, they were still Jews, of course, and still read the Old Testament. So it would seem more likely that the Old Testament is going to be the backdrop to what they're saying than the Greek mythology and the Greek tales like Orpheus and so on. You get another time Hades is used is in Revelation, at the start of Revelation chapter 1. So Jesus is talking and he says, "He's the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades." So that's another interesting passage that is basically paralleling death with Hades, which is just like we saw with Sheol. And it's this really brilliant metaphor of Jesus with the key to Hades and death. So what does that mean? Does that mean he can go down there like Orpheus and unlock the door and let people out who've been saying, "Great, we've been waiting a long time for you"? Well, no, the key that he's got is the fact that he died, but he's living again. He is the one that has been dead, that was lying in Sheol or in Hades, and God has resurrected him. So he's broken that. And, other parts of the scripture talk about him being given authority to resurrect those on the last day. So I think that probably shows the backdrop, or how they're using this term, more than the Greek tales. The only other thing about that, the tales of Orpheus, they're poetic, they're epics, aren't they? They're amazing stories. And yet the point of them, so Orpheus doesn't get his lover back, and at the last minute he does the wrong thing, and she can't come out of Hades after all, and he's overcome with grief and so on. And so what is that story about? It's a story that's emphasizing the fact and making you face up to the fact that you have to deal with grief when people are gone. They're gone. Yes, there's a mythology attached to it. It's a little bit like Pharaoh going down to Sheol and being laughed at by everyone there, saying that that they're welcoming him there as well. It's not meant to be a literal depiction, and I don't know whether anyone knows whether people thought that you could actually go somewhere called Hades and lead people out. I don't think they probably did, really.
No, I mean, you're right. It was entertainment and a story with that meaning, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned there was more than one word in the New Testament.
Yep, yeah. So the next one is Gehenna. It's interesting, just before we get to that, how that we started with that terrible picture of devils tormenting people in limbo, and that one layer of hell, and as all these popular conceptions of fire and all sorts, and yet what we've seen so far has been really nothing of the sort, has it? Actually,
there's not been any fire involved.
No fire, and unconsciousness in death, and the break from Hades or Sheol is resurrection. So we know we're talking a completely different story so far. Now, Gehenna is a word that might take us a little bit closer to those conceptions. So we need to think about this a little bit more. So Gehenna is used. So in the New Testament, of course, that we're talking about, it's translated hell in the King James and the ESV all times. So again, it's only 12 times. So we're not talking a major concept or a major word in the New Testament. It's actually a Hebrew word that's been transliterated from the Hebrew into the Greek. So that's interesting in itself, and it literally means a valley of Hinnom, or the valley of Hinnom. This is a place we're talking about, a place near Jerusalem.
Okay.
So that's kind of where it's come from. Should we look at one of the passages where it is? So Mark 9 and do 43 to 47.
So Mark chapter 9, verses 43 to 47. So here we go. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched.
Right, there we go. So we've got some fire, finally, which is great.
We have, and it's eternal fire by the sounds of it.
Well, yeah, unquenchable, which might be a little bit different than eternal.
Okay.
So yeah, you can, as we just read that, face value with the imagery of those paintings and the last 2,000 years of development of Christian theology in mind, we'll read that and think, yeah, that does sound like there's a place. And we better watch out, because we might get thrown into it if we sin, if we turn away from Christ and so on. So that's what it sounds like. But as I said, so Gehenna is, literally was a place, and there's been various sort of theories about what it means and where it's come from and what it sort of signifies. One idea was that Gehenna was the town's or the city's rubbish dump, and there was always a fire burning there. But actually, it doesn't look like there's a lot of evidence for that at all. It's I think the evidence for that is very, very late. But we find Gehenna in the Old Testament. So the best thing to do would be to have a look and see, A, what happened there, and B, what was said about it. Because that, again, like we've said, the backdrop to the words of Jesus, the backdrop to the New Testament is it's their scriptures, the Old Testament. They had that, and they read it, and they thrived on it. So in the Old Testament, in the period of times of the kings, the Valley of Hinnom was used by kings for some really terrible things, which was child sacrifice, passing unwanted children, babies, through the fire in some form of worship to gods. So really awful things happening, and that became a place of that happening. So we get King Ahaz doing that, and Manasseh as well. You'll find that in places like 2 Chronicles 33.
Okay.
So that's repeated a few times, and so the Valley of Hinnom becomes known as this terrible place. And then it gets picked up by the prophets. So the prophets of Yahweh, the prophets of God, were very unhappy with that. And so, for example, Jeremiah talks against that practice and against that fact, and uses the Valley of Hinnom as a sort of prophetic judgment oracle, or as part of his prophetic judgment oracle.
Okay.
So shall we have a look at that passage? So Jeremiah 7.
Okay, Jeremiah 7.
So verse 30 to 33.
Okay. Here we go then. Jeremiah 7 verse 30. For the sons of Judah have done evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house that is called by my name to defile it. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no more be called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth, because there is no room elsewhere.
Yeah, there we go. So it talks about passing or burning their sons and their daughters in the fire in this place. So that's that terrible practice of child sacrifice. But what Jeremiah says is this judgment is coming for that, and you're basically going to have a valley full of dead bodies. And there's going to be no room to bury them, basically. It goes on to say about the dead bodies of the people will be food for the birds of the air and for the beasts of the earth. And it's this shocking picture of, people who have been judged. And they've been judged because they've done wicked things. So, this is a place, or this is a picture, or being used as a metaphor for judgment on the wicked people.
So that sounds like, just thinking about how prophetic language works and the sort of imagery that the prophets employ, that he's picking up on, you have done these terrible things to people, and as a result that will come back on you, and using the image of what they've done to people as the depiction of how they will be judged for that, and how that will come back on them.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And it's a metaphor for the certainty of their judgment and the fact that it's a permanent judgment.
Yeah.
And notice how that, it talks about dead bodies being strewn in this valley. It's not talking about them being tormented in this valley or anything like that. It's a picture of annihilation, isn't it? A picture of being completely getting the just reward for their terrible crimes in this place of the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna.
So when Jesus says Gehenna to a Jewish audience, they're going to have this sort of passage brought to mind.
They are.
The Valley of Hinnom, and the association with, that's a place where people did terrible things, and as a result, terrible things would happen to them, from which they could never return.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the translators of the New Testament have translated that hell or hellfire. They haven't done what they did with Sheol and Hades and just left it as Gehenna.
Yeah.
And let us figure out that it's this place associated with these things.
It isn't a footnote in the ESV that it's Gehenna. So they've done that, at least. But yeah, that is interesting. I don't know if any other translation has sort of transliterated it and kept it as Gehenna. So Jesus, so you say Jesus, using this term, people would understand what he means. They definitely would when he quotes Isaiah 66. So the last verse, the last few phrases of the big book of Isaiah, the big prophecy of Isaiah. It's a funny passage. It's talking about the new heavens and the new earth, this time when it's wonderful and God's justice has come and God's kingdom is there and everything. And then, there's going to be all flesh will come and worship before me, declares the Lord. Then the last verse, and they shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me, for their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. And it's a confusing picture to us. But the idea is that not that people are literally in new creation going to spend a day trip down to go and have a look at people burning in a valley anywhere. It's showing the permanence of the death of people who are judged. That's the picture, isn't it? But you notice in that phrase that he talks about the worm shall not die, the fire shall not be quenched. That's exactly what Jesus was quoting from. So he refers to Gehenna, which we saw in Jeremiah. He's quoting this passage here, and it's all about people who've been judged, and there's no hope of them ever returning. So that I think that's what Gehenna is really trying to convey. It is conveying a time of judgment. It's saying that there will be judgment, but there's nothing in it that is talking about being tormented forever and ever.
And it's emphasizing the prospect of not being able to return from that. So it isn't, perhaps with Sheol and Hades, it's just, the natural end of human life is in the death state. And normally speaking, aside from resurrection, there is no return from that. But this is adding a layer of judgment, as in, from God's point of view, it is right that your life ends and you have no prospect of returning from that because of a moral component to it, if you like, because of things that people have done. Okay, and there is lots of mentions of fire and burning in there, and when you get to Revelation, you have the lake of fire. So it's perhaps not surprising that some of those ideas have become mingled with perhaps some of those pagan views of the underworld that Tom Holland referred to in Anglo-Saxon thinking, and have found their way into a popular conception. Okay, is there anything else to add on those words?
I mean, the only thing just to add to Gehenna is the fact that you get Jesus talking about how that the body and soul are destroyed in Gehenna.
Yeah. So
whatever you think about the word soul, and you did a whole episode on that, didn't you? And effectively, it's the whole life.
Yeah.
But even if you think it's some kind of separate thing from the person, or is the person and it's different from the body and so on, it gets destroyed in the end. It doesn't talk about something continuing forever, being tormented. So even in the very sort of straightforward view of what Jesus is saying, we're not looking at a picture of torment, we're looking at a picture of annihilation. So I think you summarized it well in that you've got Sheol and Hades as the natural death state, and then the hope of coming out of that, the way of escape, is resurrection. But there is a prospect of those judged in the future by Jesus and finding themselves judged of annihilation, of oblivion, of death forever.
Okay, so let's move on to a different aspect of it. The ideas that we've talked about, both in this one and the talking about the concept of heaven, and when we looked at the soul, we're describing ideas that when we're taking them from the Bible are somewhat different, perhaps, to how many Christians would conceive of those things. And so when we're kind of drawing those conclusions from this biblical evidence, are we on our own here? Are we ploughing a lonely furrow of biblical interpretation and kind of going off into the fringes? What are other people thinking about this?
Yeah, so we're definitely, what we're saying is we're definitely not alone. It's definitely right to say that 100 years ago, the majority view in Christianity would have been, and maybe still would be, it would be a view of the typical hell of eternal fiery torment and conscious torment at that. But, you can look all around at theologians, scholars, pastors, and people in all sorts of different parts of the Christian world and find people who are similarly troubled by the moral implications of a eternal conscious torment view, and they also are persuaded by the biblical evidence, like we've looked at. So I don't know, Old Testament scholar John Goldingay, in one of his Old Testament theology volumes, says that death is an end to my own activity. It means an end to awareness. Has a bit of a paragraph about what death is, and according to the Old Testament, which fits with what we've said. There was a really key scholar, Edward Fudge, his book called The Fire That Consumes. I think it was in 1982 when it was first published, and that basically sets the case for what's become known as annihilation, which is the view effectively that we've said. He has some differences from what I think, but in essence he goes through the biblical evidence and comes to the conclusions very similar to what we've said. But his big thing about the fire is that the fire is a consuming thing and it's unquenchable, which means it burns up the fuel. So the people who are thrown in the fire, metaphorically, are all burned up. And the fire isn't put out, it's unquenchable, and it's not put out, and then when there's no fuel left, that's it. So it's not eternal fire, like you said earlier. It's it's not fire necessarily that burns forever.
So it's unquenchable from the point of view of the fuel.
Yes, that's right.
Not from the point of view of someone outside watching.
Yeah, that he majors on that point a lot. He says throughout the Bible, from the first appearance of the phrase until its last, unquenchable fire always denotes fire that is not capable of being extinguished and is therefore irresistible. He talks about how Jesus says Jesus will burn up the chaff with the unquenchable fire. That's precisely what unquenchable fire does. So he underscores that point there, and there's a lot in his book.
Okay.
Even the late John Stott, so a really sort of prominent conservative preacher in the evangelical community, he says, he's talking about the wicked, and he says that there's no rest for them day and night. And then he says, I do not myself think that the anxious question whether the nature of hell is an eternal conscious torment or an ultimate eternal annihilation can be settled by a simple appeal to these sentences. And he's talking about some of the passages in Revelation. And he says, for one thing, we need to keep reminding ourselves that the content of Revelation is a symbolic vision, not literal reality, which is, really interesting. And he kind of sits on the fence a bit, but he's known for going towards annihilation. So no, we're definitely not on our own. There's lots of other people out there saying these things about hell for the reasons we've talked about.
Okay, that's really interesting. So let's just try and wrap up and bring a few threads together from some of the things that we've covered in this episode, and the one on heaven and the one on soul, because those three subjects are clearly linked, and when you take the popular, but maybe less popular than it was, Christian notion of an immortal soul that either goes to heaven or hell, as different places with different experiences, those three ideas are connected, and we've unpicked each of those. And so I would expect, therefore, that what we've come to as conclusions about the meaning of soul and heaven and hell would form a different but coherent, linked up picture. So can you help us kind of tie together what we've concluded from those different explorations of those concepts?
Yeah, so it does all tie together, and they are, of course, all linked. So when we looked at the word soul and what it means and how the Bible understands the nature of people, we realized that it's talking about the whole life, the whole being, as it were, and that people are mortal. They don't have something in them which carries on after death. That's not part of the biblical depiction. So if that's what we are, mortal people, but in God's image, called to live a higher calling, called to accept the rule of God, the rule of heaven, it makes sense that if we don't have some kind of immortal soul within us, it makes sense that we're not expecting to float off to heaven when we die or anything like that. And therefore the conception of heaven being God's domain, and how that we ought to be raised into that now in a sense, and how we're looking for heaven and earth to come back together, be united. That's what we want, and it's of course through Jesus that we do that. We're not in fear of a God who is looking to throw us into hell, throw us into fiery torment forever. Because again, it doesn't fit with what we know we are. We're people whose existence will end when we die. So death is the enemy. Death's the real enemy here, and it's Jesus who has the key to death and Hades, death and Sheol. The death state can be broken because he's been resurrected, and he can take us from that because he can elevate us to the position of being in a relationship with God. To live in the world, in his kingdom, in new creation, in restored world, just as God intended. So in a summary, in a really sort of high level summary, that's the biblical picture of what our lives are, what we're intended for, and what we need to escape from, sin and death, which is it's changed it completely, actually, hasn't it? From the conceptions of living in fear of putting one foot wrong, and then you might end up in hell, or if you're lucky, you might be able to spend a bit of time in purgatory. And we're talking totally different worldviews, aren't we? Yeah,
and that's what I sort of picked up as you were describing that it's not a fear-focused view. It's actually a love and forgiveness and acceptance into a relationship with God focus that comes through much more strongly with the biblical meanings of soul and heaven and hell. It seems also to, coming back to the point that we sort of started with, it resolves the moral issue of God inflicting eternal torment on finite beings. And because there is a fundamental problem with that, in that when we think about how God has shown himself to us through Jesus, that's just not the kind of character that comes through in Jesus. And so there's a fundamental tension, conflict, a jarring conflict with that presentation of God through Jesus.
Yeah, it talks about Jesus being full of grace and truth, doesn't it? In John chapter 1, which is a really good way of summarizing the character of God from Exodus 34, and how that's really interesting there, because it's talking about mercy but truth as well, which is justice, isn't it? That's that sort of thing. And it's the opposite of the fiery hell view is a universalism, which is that we're all going to kind of end up redeemed in the end. We might have to go through various forms of redemption, or you might burn for a little bit, but then you're redeemed. And there's lots of different views of that. And that's a very tempting view to take. And we kind of do want everyone to be saved and everyone redeemed. And God even himself says that, he's not willing that any should perish, but he really values justice and truth as well, as you can see. And interestingly, in between those two extremes of fiery hell, which seems to be so out of character, and actually universalism, where actually that seems out of character of God as well.
Both of those extremes, either universalism or eternal torment, seem to strip away the morality of a God that's interested in right and wrong. There is right and there is wrong.
Yep.
So, okay, we better draw to a close. It's a fascinating discussion, and with almost every topic that we cover, we almost always seem to land on Jesus. So we've done that again, which is great. So thank you very much, Dan, for being part of this conversation. And thank you to everyone who's listened. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. And as always, when you are in your podcast app, then rate or put a review of us. It makes it easier for people to find us. And if you want to make a comment, go to our website, biblefeed.org, and our Facebook page under Bible Feed. Look us up there and follow us there. So thank you once again, Dan, and we'll be back soon.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like to discuss. So get in touch with us through our Facebook page, or send us a message on our website at biblefeed.org, and be part of the journey.